For 2,000 years we have painted him wrong. The flowing white robes, the smooth, uncalloused hands, the pristine sandals that never seemed to gather dust, the face that looks more like a Renaissance prince than a Galilean Jew. But the man who walked the dusty roads of first-century Palestine did not look like the man hanging in your church. Archaeology, the original Greek of the Gospels, and the ancient Hebrew law of Moses are telling a story most pulpits have never told. What Jesus actually wore for 33 years on this earth is more humble, more shocking, and more divine than any painting ever made of him. In this video, we are going to follow the cloth. From the strips that bound him at his birth, to the tunic stained with limestone dust, to the seamless robe a Roman soldier could not bring himself to tear. And by the end, you will see why the very last piece of cloth he left behind in an empty tomb proved exactly who he was all along. This is not a sermon. This is an investigation. And the evidence has been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years. It was a winter night. The stable was small, dim, half carved into the limestone hill behind the inn. The smell of wet straw mixed with the warm animal smell of an ox shifting its weight in the dark. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and then was silent. The air bit through the wool. Mary was 15, maybe 16. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from cold and exhaustion. She had given birth less than an hour before. The baby in the feeding trough was wrinkled and wet and impossibly small. She reached for the bag Joseph had carried from Nazareth. Inside were long strips of unbleached wool, torn carefully from a larger cloth, and a small clay pot of coarse salt. She salted his skin first. The grit clung to his arms and his chest. Her own hands burned where the salt found the small cracks in her fingers. It was the practice of every Jewish mother of her time, believed to cleanse, to toughen, to declare.
This child is mine.
Then she began to wrap, around the legs, around the arms across the chest, tighter and tighter, the way her own mother had taught her. The way Elizabeth had taught her again in the hill country of Judah. The bands pressed his tiny limbs against his body until he could not move. She paused. She looked down at her son. He cannot move. The God who flung the stars across the sky cannot lift his own hand. Outside the stable, far on the dark hills, an angel was speaking to shepherds. And the sign he gave them, was not a crown, not a flash of light, not a voice from the heavens. The sign was cloth. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. What few people know is that swaddling in the first century was a legal declaration. In the Greco-Roman world, abandoned infants were left exposed on hillsides to die or be claimed as slaves. To not salt and swaddle a baby was a public sign that the parents had disowned it. To salt and swaddle was to say to the watching world, I claim this child. I will protect him. He is mine. And so the very first garment of God in the flesh was a cloth that bound him, a cloth that said, I am claimed, I am loved, I am owned by people who will die for me. These same coarse strips of cloth would prefigure something else, something far more terrible, something we will not see for another 33 years. Mary did not know that yet. She tucked the last strip under his chin and laid him in the manger. The ox shifted again, and then silence. 30 years of silence. It was just after dawn in Sepphoris. The Roman city had been burned to the ground 16 years earlier, when Jesus was a small boy. Now, every able-bodied Jewish stonemason in the Galilee region was being hired to rebuild it. 4 miles from Nazareth, a long walk before the sun rose, a longer walk back after it set. Jesus was 22. He sat on the edge of a half-built wall, eating a piece of barley bread harder than the stone beneath him. His tunic, the exomus, fastened over only one shoulder, hung loose around his chest. The other shoulder was bare and brown from the summer. A leather belt cinched the wool at his waist. A small pouch held 3 iron chisels and a wooden mallet worn smooth by years of his own grip. A Roman foreman walked past in a clean white tunic with a thin purple stripe down the side. He did not look at Jesus. He did not look at any of the Jewish workers. He counted them with his eyes, the way a man counts cattle, and walked on. The man working beside Jesus spat into the dust. His name was Asher. He was older. His back was bent in a way that would never straighten again.
They burn our city. We rebuild their city.
Asher took a long drink from a leather skin of well water. The water was bitter.
And they walk past us like we are the stones.
Jesus said nothing. He picked up his chisel.
30 years. How much longer must I be hidden?
He set the iron against the limestone block. He raised the mallet. The strike rang sharp and high in the cool morning air. White dust puffed up in a small cloud and settled on the back of his hand. Pale streaks of it clung to the sweat already forming on his forearm. By midday, that limestone dust would line his mouth and his lungs, the way it lined the lungs of every man who had worked these walls for a decade. The Greek word the Gospel of Mark uses for his occupation is tekton. For 2,000 years, it has been translated carpenter in nearly every English Bible you have ever opened. But that translation hides the truth. Tekton in Koine Greek meant artisan, builder, craftsman. And in 1st century Galilee, where heavy timber was scarce and limestone was everywhere, the archaeological record is now almost unanimous. Most tektons were primarily stoneworkers, not woodworkers. This changes everything we thought we knew about him. A man who works stone for 30 years does not have soft hands. His palms split and re-heal 1,000 times until the skin becomes thick and discolored. His shoulders broaden from lifting blocks heavier than his own body. His back carries an ache that never fully leaves. His lungs carry the fine white dust of limestone deep into the chest, where it stays. 30 years. What does that mean for one body? It means a man who tied his sandals each morning before the sun rose. A man who came home in the evening and rubbed olive oil into his palms because the skin had cracked again. A man whose mother kept a small clay jar of that oil by the door because she had been doing it for him since he was 12. A man whose tunic, by the end of every day, was streaked with sweat and white dust and the dried blood of yet another split knuckle. For 3 decades, the Son of God did this. Have you ever felt invisible because of what you were wearing? Have you ever known what it is to be dismissed because of cloth? The Son of God knew that feeling for 30 years. Back home in Nazareth, in a small house at the edge of the village, a woman in her late 40s sat by the door mending a tunic. The cloth in her lap was the 3rd one she had stitched for him. The first 2 he had outgrown. The wool was rough and her fingers were quick. She did not look up when he walked in, covered in dust at the end of the day. She just folded the mended tunic and set it where he would find it in the morning. When, at last, he stepped out of the workshop forever and walked the 4 miles to the Jordan River to be baptized, the people of his own village stared at him in disbelief. They had a question, and the question itself was an insult.
Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?
Translation: we know what this man's hands look like. We know his clothes. We saw him sweat for 30 years. He is not a rabbi. He is one of us. And in that question, you can see how completely he had hidden. Capernaum, at the 3rd hour of the morning. The marketplace was already loud. Fishermen from the lake hauled wicker baskets dripping with the night's catch. The sharp smell of fish guts mixed with fresh bread from a clay oven. A boy chased a goat through the crowd until a woman caught him by the ear. Somewhere, a child was crying. A man pushed through the crowd, around 40. A working man's tunic, faded and earth-toned, a heavy cloak draped over his left shoulder, falling almost to his ankles in the back. The fabric was the color of dust and old straw. Nothing about him drew the eye, but watch where the camera follows him. He passed a Pharisee in deep, expensive linen, bright white, the kind that required hours of bleaching in a fuller's yard. The Pharisee's tunic was sewn with thin scarlet clavi down the front. Long phylacteries were strapped to his forehead. Wide tassels, much wider than the law required, swung importantly at his ankles. He saw the working man approach. His eyes flicked over the dust-stained cloak with quiet contempt. 2 garments. That was the working man's entire wardrobe. The inner garment was the chiton, 2 large rectangles of woolen cloth stitched at the shoulders and down the sides, with simple openings for the head and arms. No fitted sleeves. The fabric was wide, and when the leather belt cinched it at the waist, the excess fell over the upper arms like short, baggy folds. For laborers, the chiton stopped just below the knee. He passed a Roman officer next. The officer wore a clean white tunic edged in purple. Purple so expensive, the dye was extracted from the murex snails of the Mediterranean coast at 20 times its weight in gold. Roman law made it a capital crime for a commoner to wear the imperial colors. The officer did not even register the man in the dust-stained cloak. Over the chiton came the himation, the outer cloak, the mantle. A heavy rectangular piece of wool, sometimes nearly 4 feet by 6. By day, a coat. By night, a blanket. For a poor man traveling, the himation was his bed. This is why the Mosaic Law contains a strange-sounding command in Exodus. If a creditor takes a man's cloak as collateral, he must return it before sunset. Why? Because the cloak is the man's bed. To take a man's himation overnight is to leave him to freeze. This is also why the working man's later words on a hillside outside this very town would sound so radical.
If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well.
He was telling his followers, give them your bed, give them your blanket, give them the last thing you own. He kept walking. He passed a beggar at the corner of a low wall. The beggar was missing 1 leg. His tunic was torn and gray, and he held out a copper bowl with 3 coins in it. The working man stopped. He bent down. He said something the marketplace could not hear. He laid his hand on the beggar's shoulder. The beggar wept. It was customary in that time for poor people to wear 2 tunics, a thinner inner tunic and a heavier outer one. This was the normal level of poverty. But the man bending over the beggar refused even that. When he sent out 12 disciples some months later, He commanded them.
Do not take 2 tunics.
He practiced what he preached. He traveled through the cities of Israel with 1 tunic, 1 cloak, nothing else. The 2nd century pagan philosopher Celsus mocked Christianity for exactly this reason. He wrote that the founder of this new faith looked more like a beggar asking for money on the side of the road than a king or a philosopher. That mockery was closer to the truth than Celsus knew. The Pharisee in the white linen turned his shoulder away as the working man stood up from the beggar. But the Pharisee had not noticed something on the 4 corners of the dust-stained cloak, something most of the marketplace was not noticing either. 8 white threads at each of the 4 corners, and 1 thread at the center of each tassel that caught the morning light and held it. A thread of brilliant, impossible blue. They were called tzitzit, tassels, fringes. 8 threads emerging from each of the 4 corners of the cloak, bound together by 5 carefully tied knots. They swayed at his ankles with every step. They were not decoration. They were a direct command from the mouth of God in the book of Numbers, chapter 15. Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. Every Jewish man was required to wear them, not on a special prayer shawl tucked away for synagogue, on his everyday cloak. The tzitzit walked into the marketplace. They walked into the workshop. They brushed the dust as a man labored. But here is what most people miss. The tzitzit was a code. In Hebrew numerology, the numerical value of the word tzitzit is exactly 600. Each tassel held 8 individual threads, bound by 5 knots. 600 plus 8 plus 5. The sum is 613. That is the exact number of commandments in the Torah. Jesus walked through Galilee with the entire law of God woven into the corners of his cloak. And then there was the blue thread. Of the 8 threads in each tassel, 7 were the natural off-white of sheep's wool, but 1 was techelet, a brilliant, vibrant sky blue. And techelet was no ordinary dye. It was extracted from a marine snail called the murex, harvested from the Mediterranean sea floor. Thousands of snails crushed for a few drops of liquid. The dye then exposed to direct sunlight, for the chemical shift from purple to blue required ultraviolet light. The process was so labor-intensive that historical records show techelet was, at times, worth 20 times its weight in solid gold. In the Roman Empire, sumptuary laws made it a capital offense for a commoner to wear such colors. Emperors monopolized blue and purple as the ultimate symbols of imperial power. And yet, the God of Israel commanded every poor Jewish shepherd, every fisherman, every beggar, to wear a thread of royal blue at the corners of his cloak. The law was subverting empire by sewing royalty into the clothing of peasants. And on a crowded street in Capernaum, on a morning that had begun like any other morning, a woman who had not been touched in 12 years was watching that thread. She had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. What does that mean for one woman? Under Levitical law, she had been ceremonially unclean for 12 years. She had not been embraced by a husband in 12 years. She had not stepped inside the temple in 12 years. She had not eaten at a shared table in 12 years. Every coin she ever had was gone, spent on physicians who could not heal her. Every door had closed. Every friend had stopped visiting. Every morning for 12 years, she had woken up and remembered the same sentence.
I am untouchable.
And now she was in a crowd. If anyone discovered her condition, she would be driven out and possibly stoned for defiling them. She kept her head down. She kept the edge of her shawl across her face. She slid sideways through the press of bodies, one hand against the rough wool of the man in front of her, and she watched the swaying threads at the bottom of the working man's cloak. She had heard the prophecy of Malachi all her life. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in his wings. The Hebrew word for wings is kanaf. It is the same word used for the four corners of a garment, the same corners where the tzitzit hang. She thought, the wings, the corners. If I can just touch the wings of his cloak. She crouched lower. The crowd pressed in. Her own heartbeat was louder than the marketplace. Her trembling fingers reached toward the dust, toward the swaying threads. The Greek word the Gospel of Matthew uses for what she touched is kraspedon, the Septuagint translation of tzitzit. She did not touch random cloth. She reached, in faith, for the messianic prophecy hanging from his clothes. Her finger brushed the blue thread. A warmth flooded her abdomen. The bleeding of 12 years stopped between one breath and the next. She froze. Then she began to back away into the crowd. Slowly. 1 step, 2, 3. She had gotten away with it. She had been healed. No one had seen. Tonight she would sleep in her own bed, and tomorrow she would walk to the temple and they would let her in. Then he stopped walking. The crowd kept moving for another half second. Then it stopped too. The marketplace went quiet. The kind of sudden quiet that happens when people know something is about to occur. He turned. His eyes searched the crowd. She froze in the middle of stepping backward.
He knows. They will all know. They will stone me here.
His voice carried over every head.
Who touched the wing of my garment?
His disciples laughed nervously.
Master, the crowd is pressing in on every side. Many people have touched you.
He did not look at them. He kept searching. Her knees gave out. She stepped forward through the parting bodies. She fell at his feet. The dust of the marketplace pressed against her forehead. She told him everything. The years, the doctors, the despair, the touch. And her voice cracked open in front of strangers who had never been allowed to know her. He did not step back. He did not pull his cloak away from her. He knelt down in the dust of the marketplace. He lifted her chin with the calloused hand of a stonemason. He said one word, daughter. She had not been called daughter in 12 years. There is something we instinctively understand about reaching for the smallest piece of something holy, and about being seen the moment we touch it. It was just after dawn. A Roman cohort marched through Capernaum on its way south to Caesarea. 600 men in iron-studded boots. The boots were called caligae, heavy leather soles thickened with multiple layers and driven through with dozens of iron hobnails. The hobnails were a weapon. When 600 soldiers marched in unison on stone pavements, the sound of those iron studs striking stone was deafening. The clatter rolled ahead of the cohort by half a mile. It echoed off the walls of houses. It rattled clay cups on shelves. It was meant to. A woman in a doorway pulled her children inside. A merchant lowered his eyes and shoved a basket of figs under his stall. A small boy, peering around a corner, was yanked back by his older sister. The cohort marched on, the sound of empire announcing itself. That same evening, after the cohort had passed and the dust had settled, The working man walked out of the village toward a hillside above the lake, alone. The sun was setting behind the western hills. The light turned his drab cloak the color of bronze. He walked slowly. The only sound was his own breathing and the soft scuff of leather on dust. His sandals were entirely silent. In 1964, archaeologists working at the desert fortress of Masada uncovered something extraordinary. The dry atmosphere of the Judean desert had preserved organic materials that would have rotted away anywhere else. Among the skeletons of Jewish defenders who died there in 73 AD, archaeologists found nearly complete pairs of leather sandals from the 1st century. 3 layers of tanned animal hide pressed together, stitched through with thick leather thongs. A simple strap that passed between the big toe and the second toe, wrapped around the heel and tied at the ankle, completely nail-less. Not one piece of iron in the entire sandal. The Jewish craftsmen had been making them this way for centuries. The leather wore out, but the sandal made no sound. A widow watching from her doorway, his name, as he passed. A small boy with no shoes ran behind him for a few paces, just to be near. The working man turned and smiled at the boy, and kept walking. 2 kingdoms, 2 sounds, 1 day. While Rome marched in metal, the King of Kings approached every city on quiet feet. The kingdom of heaven did not arrive in armor. It came near to the broken without a sound. There is one more detail about his sandals that the Bible records, and most readers miss its weight. In ancient Jewish culture, untying the leather straps of a guest's sandals, caked in the dust and animal waste of the road, was considered the lowest task in the household. So degrading that it was reserved for Gentile slaves. A Jewish servant could not be required to do it. And John the Baptist, the greatest prophet born of woman, said that he was unworthy even of that. But on the night before his death, the working man took off his outer cloak, wrapped a linen towel around his waist like a slave, and knelt at the feet of his own disciples. He untied their sandals. He washed the dust of the road from feet that would scatter at his arrest. And by the time the rooster crowed the next morning, those silent sandals had walked one final road. The road to a hill called the Place of the Skull. It was Friday, around the 3rd hour of the morning. Golgotha sat just outside the western gate of Jerusalem, a low, rocky outcrop shaped like the top of a human skull. The city behind it was crowded with Passover pilgrims. The smell of roasting lamb drifted from 1,000 cooking fires. Below the hill, in a fig orchard that no one was thinking about, a small bird was singing. His name was Marcus. He was 31 years old. He had been in the Roman army for 14 years. He had served quaternion duty, execution detail, at least 60 times. He had divided the clothes of bandits, rebels, runaway slaves, common thieves. He kept the leather strap on his belt that he used for casting lots when there was something worth gambling for. Most of the time, there wasn't. He spread the working man's cloak on the dusty ground beside the cross. The cloak was heavy, drab, woven from undyed wool. He started counting the corners by habit so he could divide it into 4 equal parts, and then he stopped. There were tassels on the corners, 8 white threads at each one, and in the center of each tassel, a single thread of an impossible blue. He had seen these threads before on the cloaks of the Jews in this region. He did not know what they meant. He did not care. He drew his knife and cut the cloak into 4 pieces along the seams, 1 piece for each soldier of his quaternion. The blue threads went into his pile. Above him, on the cross, The working man was breathing in the shallow, broken pattern of crucifixion. Marcus did not look up. He had heard 1,000 men die. There was nothing new to see. He folded his quarter of the cloak. Then he reached for the inner tunic. He went to tear it. His hands stopped. He stared at the cloth. He turned it over. He turned it again. The tunic had no seams. The Apostle John, standing close enough to the cross to hear his dying master speak to his mother, was watching every move the soldiers made. And John pauses the entire crucifixion narrative in the middle of the most catastrophic moment in human history to record one specific detail. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. The Greek word is araphos, without seams, without sutures, a garment woven whole on a single wide loom in one continuous piece of cloth. This was not how working men's tunics were made. Standard Judean tunics were sewn from 2 rectangular pieces of fabric joined at the shoulders. A seamless tunic required a wider loom and far more advanced weaving. It was not the tunic of a peasant. And John adds a phrase, woven from the top down. The Greek word for from the top is anothen. If you have read the Gospel of John before, that word should make you stop breathing. Anothen, from above, from the top, of divine origin. It is the same word he used with Nicodemus the Pharisee, who came to him by night. Unless one is born anothen, from above, he cannot see the kingdom of God. It is the same word Matthew and Mark use to describe what was happening at that exact hour, 3/4 of a mile away, inside the Temple of Jerusalem. The massive curtain that shielded the Holy of Holies, 60 feet tall, 4 inches thick, woven of blue and purple and scarlet, embroidered with cherubim, was tearing in two. Anothen, from the top down, by no human hand. Marcus did not know any of this. He held the seamless tunic in his hands and stared at it.
Why am I afraid of a piece of cloth?
He looked up at the working man on the cross for the first time. The man's eyes were closed. His shoulders, even bleeding and torn, were broad in a way Marcus knew. He had seen those shoulders before. They were the shoulders of every Jewish stonemason who had built Roman walls in this region. Marcus looked back at the tunic. He spoke without thinking.
Let us not tear it. Let us cast lots for it.
The other 3 soldiers shrugged. They had no idea why he was hesitating. They threw the lots. Marcus won. He folded the seamless tunic carefully and set it beside him in the dust. Around the same moment, in the temple, the high priest was supervising the final preparations for the Passover lamb. He was standing 20 feet from the great curtain when he heard a sound he could not identify. A long, slow tearing of fabric. He turned. The curtain, 60 feet of woven blue and purple and scarlet, was splitting from the top down by no human hand. He stumbled backward. He fell to his knees. He could see, through the parted veil, the empty room where God had once dwelt. In 2 places, at the same hour, on the same morning, in the same city, God was telling the same story in cloth. In the book of Exodus, chapter 28, God gave Moses meticulous instructions for the garments of the high priest of Israel. The high priest was the only man who could enter the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement to make atonement for the sins of the entire nation. The first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus recorded a specific detail about the high priest's robe. It was seamless, woven in one piece. The Levitical law in chapter 21, verse 10, contained a strict prohibition. The high priest was forbidden from ever tearing his garments. On Golgotha, the soldiers could not bring themselves to tear his robe. In the temple, the curtain tore on its own. The true high priest had begun the final sacrifice. Look at the cloth. Mary's hands tying swaddling bands around the limbs of the infant God. The bands so tight he could not lift his own hand. Cut. Mary's hands stitching a small wool tunic for the boy on his 7th birthday. The tunic she would later mend twice and outgrow 3 times. Cut. Mary's hands at the foot of the cross. Empty. Trembling. Watching 4 Roman soldiers divide the cloak she had woven for him on the loom in her own house in Nazareth. The cloak she had once wrapped around his shoulders herself the morning he left for the Jordan. Cut. Mary's hands the next morning at dawn, walking toward a tomb with a small jar of myrrh, and finding the stone rolled away. 4 pieces of cloth. 1 mother, 1 son, 1 salvation. A Roman centurion named Longinus stood at the foot of the cross. He had been there since the 3rd hour. He had seen Marcus stop at the seamless tunic. He had seen the sky go black at noon. He had felt the ground shake beneath his sandals at the 9th hour. He had killed many men.
None of them looked at me like that.
The working man on the cross had looked at him once, not with hatred, not with curse, but with something Longinus had no Roman word for. And in that moment, the centurion of an execution detail outside Jerusalem whispered the words that the Roman emperor was supposed to be the only man worthy of.
Truly, this man was the Son of God.
3 days passed. Sunday morning, just after dawn. Peter and John were running. Peter was older, but John was faster. John reached the tomb first, but did not enter. He bent down and looked inside. He saw the linen cloths lying flat. He stopped breathing. Peter pushed past him, breathless, and stepped inside. The linen cloths were lying exactly where the body had been, but flat, collapsed, as if the body inside them had simply vanished and the wrappings had settled into the empty space. The face cloth, the sudarion that had covered his head, was folded neatly by itself in a separate place. John stepped in behind Peter. He saw what Peter saw. He folded them. He folded them like a man finishing his work. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 16, the Day of Atonement ritual contained one final action. After the high priest had sprinkled the blood of the sacrifice on the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies, after the atonement was complete, he was required by law to take off his linen garments and leave them behind in the tent of meeting. His work was finished. He left his garments folded and walked out. 2,000 years ago, in a borrowed tomb outside Jerusalem, the true high priest rose from the dead and folded his linen burial cloths neatly behind him. The atonement was complete. The work was finished. He left his garments behind. A boy, maybe 7 years old, sat on the floor of a small room in a quiet house. He was looking at a painting of Jesus on the wall, the flowing white robe, the golden hair falling in soft waves, the smooth, uncalloused hands holding a small lamb, the serene, almost European face. The boy turned to his grandmother sitting in a chair by the window with her Bible open in her lap. He asked her one question.
Did Jesus really look like that?
His grandmother set down her Bible. She looked at the painting for a long time. Then she looked at her grandson and she shook her head slowly.
No, child. He did not look like that.
He looked like a man who had built things with his hands. He had calluses where you have soft skin. He had limestone dust in his lungs. His shoulders were broad from lifting stones heavier than he was. His face was browned by a sun that does not shine in this country. He wore the cloth of the poor, wool faded by years of the Galilean sun. And he wore the threads of a king, a single sky blue thread that no emperor in Rome could afford to wear. He walked thousands of miles in nail-less leather sandals, while the armies of the world clattered past him in iron. And on the day he died, the soldiers who killed him could not bring themselves to tear his robe, because the cloth itself was telling them what their eyes refused to see.
He looked like one of us, child. That was the whole point.
The world looked at his clothing and saw a beggar. Heaven looked at his clothing and saw the high priest of all creation. The question is, which eyes do you have today? Because the same Jesus who walked dusty roads in faded wool is still moving among the poor and the broken, still wearing the clothes of the overlooked. And most of the world still misses him for the same reason. If today, watching this video, you have only ever seen the surface of this man, the painting on the wall, the figure in stained glass, the white robes and the polished hands, ask him to open your eyes. Ask him to let you see the real Jesus, the tecton, the traveler, the high priest, the lamb, the risen king. He came wrapped in cloth that bound him. He left behind cloth that was folded. And between those two pieces of fabric, the salvation of the world was woven. Now I want to hear from you. Which moment moved you most? Mary tying the swaddling cloths, the bleeding woman reaching for the blue thread, the Roman soldier who could not bring himself to tear the tunic, or the linen folded in an empty tomb? Tell me in the comments. If this video opened your eyes to something you had never seen before, hit the like button so the algorithm shares it with someone else who needs to see Jesus the way he really was. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss the next investigation. And share this with one person, a friend, a family member, someone who has only ever seen the painting and never the man. The cloth has been telling the story all along. May we have the eyes to read it.